My dear girl, the first line read. I hope one day you'll forgive what I couldn't tell your mother. I sat frozen, the pen imprint still pressed into the paper. My late husband's journal wasn't written to me, it was written to our daughter. Tell me where you're listening from, and subscribe to Her Voices, Your Voice Matters. My name is Ruth Callahan. I'm 64 years old and live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a small white house that still smells faintly of the cedar Daniel used to sand in the garage. My husband, Daniel Callahan, passed away last winter after a quiet battle with his heart. We were married 40 years, 40 seasons of shared routines, quiet dinners, and small mercies. Our marriage was never dramatic. It was steady, like a library clock that always kept time. I suppose that's fitting, since I spent my career as a high school librarian. I believed in the order of shelves, the comfort of labeling things, even when life itself refused to be cataloged. Since Daniel's passing, my days have slowed into predictable rhythms. I wake before sunrise, make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon, and read the paper front to back, even the classifieds. In the afternoons, I volunteer at the local library, shelving returns or helping students with research. It keeps my hands busy and my mind from drifting too far into memories. Evenings are quiet. I eat dinner by the kitchen window where Daniel used to sit, his newspaper folded neatly beside his plate. I haven't moved his chair. Grief makes strange rituals of the smallest habits. Our daughter Marissa lives in Atlanta. She's 35 now, confident, independent, always in motion. I raised her to stand on her own, but sometimes I wonder if I taught her too well. She visits when she can, but work keeps her busy. We talk on Sundays. Her voice sounds rushed, clipped, as if even love must fit between calendar reminders. I don't blame her. The world moves faster than it did when I was her age. Still, there are nights I wish she'd call, just to sit in silence with me, the way she used to as a girl. Daniel adored her. From the moment she could walk, she followed him everywhere, to the garden, the hardware store, even his classroom when I had late shifts. He called her Little Scholar and promised she'd grow up to do something meaningful. They shared a language I sometimes envied, full of inside jokes, books, and big questions. I was proud of their bond, even when it left me on the sidelines. When he passed, I told myself there were no secrets between us. He'd left his life in neat folders, insurance papers, medical files, a will carefully typed and signed, everything in its place, as always. I thought that was our legacy, simplicity and truth. So when I began sorting through his study this spring, I expected to find nothing more than lesson plans and old grading rubrics. Instead, I found that leather journal worn smooth at the edges, his handwriting still dark and certain. It was strange, really. Daniel never wrote for himself. He was a talker, not a diarist. So when I opened it and saw the words, "My dear girl," I assumed he meant me. But by the second paragraph, I realized the truth. The letters were addressed to Marissa. There were pages of them, reflections, advice, and something else beneath the lines. They weren't meant for me to read. Yet there I was, holding years of words written by the man I thought I knew better than anyone. In that moment, I felt both blessed and intruding, as if I'd stumbled into a conversation between two people I loved in different ways. My first instinct was to close the journal, but grief has a way of demanding clarity. I needed to understand why Daniel wrote to our daughter instead of speaking to her, and what he couldn't tell me after 4 decades together. If you've ever discovered something that changed how you saw the person you loved most, share it in the comments. I'd like to know how you handled it. And subscribe to Her Voices, where every truth finds a home. It was late on a Sunday afternoon when I decided to go through Daniel's things. Rain tapped against the windows, steady and calm, the kind that turns memory into company. I had already boxed his shirts for donation and stacked his books in tidy piles when I found the journal wedged behind an old dictionary. It was brown leather, soft as old gloves, with his initials faintly pressed on the corner D. C. The ribbon bookmark was frayed. I thought it would be full of quotes or lesson plans. He used to jot down Shakespeare passages for his students. Instead, I found his voice aimed somewhere else. The first page began like a letter. "My dear girl," it read, "today you turned 25, and I keep thinking of the day you learned to ride your bike. You fell hard, and I told you to try again, though your mother wanted to pick you up. You looked at me with such trust that I feared I'd never deserve it." I smiled, remembering that day. The words were tender, so completely him. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. One entry dated the 3rd of April 2018 stopped me cold. "Marissa," he wrote, "there's something I never found the courage to tell your mother. It isn't infidelity or shame. It's a truth I carried alone because I thought I was protecting her peace. If you ever read this, forgive me for asking you to share my burden. My breath caught. I read that line again and again. What truth could separate us even in death? The next pages seemed to circle around regret. He wrote about time lost, about teaching years spent chasing respect while missing birthdays, about a trip to the lake house that he and Marissa never spoke of again. You were only 9, he wrote, and I promised your mother you wouldn't see the argument. I broke that promise. You saw everything. I closed the journal. The memory. I returned faintly that summer when Daniel and I fought about his long hours and my loneliness. I thought Marissa had slept through it. Maybe she hadn't. I stared at his handwriting, steady and sure. He had written these entries over years, each dated, each signed, Love, Dad. I began marking the margins with sticky notes, my librarian's habit taking over. Patterns appeared. Mentions of forgiveness, of a lesson I owe you, of letters I'll never send. He had been writing to her in secret, maybe as a form of apology. But what was the mistake I made long ago? The next morning, I brewed coffee and opened the journal again, hoping daylight might make it easier to bear. I found an entry from July 2019. Your mother still thinks the world is orderly. I envy her faith in that. When you're older, you'll understand that love means hiding certain storms until they pass. That line pierced me. He hadn't written it for cruelty. It was confession mixed with protection. I walked through the house, touching the things he left behind: his watch, his glasses, his favorite pen. I whispered, "What did you keep from me, Daniel?" The air felt different, like his absence was now filled with a question instead of silence. Later that week, I called Marissa. "Sweetheart," I said, "do you remember your father's journal? Did he ever mention writing one for you?" She sounded puzzled. "No, Mom. Dad wrote to me sometimes, cards on birthdays, but not a journal." I hesitated. "I found one. It's full of letters addressed to you." There was a pause. "Letters? About what?" she asked. I told her I didn't know yet, only that they seemed personal. "Do you want me to send them?" I asked. She sighed. "Maybe read them first. I'm not sure I'm ready." After we hung up, I felt torn, caught between respect for Daniel's privacy and my own right to understand the man I'd loved for 4 decades. Curiosity felt like betrayal, yet so did ignorance. Finally, I decided to read it all. If he had written those words for our daughter, then perhaps they were also meant to reach me in some roundabout way. By evening, I had filled half a notebook with notes and questions. At the top of the page, I wrote the 3rd of April 2018, the day truth began hiding. I didn't yet know what that truth was, only that it had lived quietly between us for years. I closed the journal and set it on the table, my hands trembling, the coffee gone cold beside it. Love had always been our language of reason, not secrets. Now I wasn't sure which was stronger, the peace he'd protected or the silence he'd left me to break. If you've ever discovered words meant for someone else and had to decide what to do with them, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Her Voices, where every heart finds its truth. For 2 days I left the journal untouched, as if it might change on its own if I gave it time. But curiosity is a quiet tide. It pulls even when you try to stand still. On the 3rd morning, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. I opened the journal again and began reading from where I had stopped. The next few letters were full of warmth. Daniel wrote about Marissa's college years, her first job, her stubbornness that matched his own. Then, the tone changed. "You're more like me than your mother realizes," he wrote. "You carry questions instead of fears. If you ever find yourself near the lake again, look beneath the dockboards. You'll see what forgiveness can look like." My pulse quickened. I had no idea what he meant, but the mention of the lake again pulled me backward in time. We used to visit Lake Elmore every summer when Marissa was young. We stopped going after she turned 10, though I never understood why. Daniel had said it was too far, too expensive, and that we needed to travel less. I believed him. Now, I wondered. I flipped through more pages. In the back of the journal, taped under the final entry, was a small envelope. The handwriting on the front was his steady, formal, deliberate. "For Marissa, when she's ready." I held it for a long time. The paper had yellowed slightly. My instincts told me not to open it yet. Instead, I placed it inside a clear sleeve and slipped it into my notebook. When I turned the last few pages, something fluttered out: a photograph. It was of Marissa as a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, standing beside a young woman I didn't recognize. Daniel was in the frame too, his arm resting lightly on the woman's shoulder. The picture was taken at the lake. My heart thudded. I stared at it, trying to place the woman. She looked to be in her 20s, smiling, wearing a university sweatshirt, someone Daniel might have taught. I flipped the photo over. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, it read, "For the day she understands." I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I needed answers. The next morning, I drove to the university where Daniel had taught for nearly 30 years. His colleague, Dr. Leonard Brooks, still worked there, running the literature department. Leonard had always been kind to me, a quiet man who remembered everything and said little. When he saw me, he smiled gently. "Ruth," he said, "it's good to see you, though I wish it were under happier reasons." We sat in his office surrounded by books. I placed the photograph on his desk. "Leonard, do you recognize this woman?" He squinted, adjusting his glasses. "Yes," he said slowly. "That's Rebecca Hill. She was Daniel's student a long time ago. Brilliant girl. Wrote her thesis on Whitman." "Why?" I told him I found the picture in Daniel's journal. Leonard hesitated. "Ruth, I think Daniel always carried guilt about that year. Rebecca was struggling family problems, depression. He helped her through it, maybe too much. It became complicated." He looked at me, kindly. "Nothing improper happened as far as I know, but Daniel blamed himself when she left school. He said he'd failed her." I sat very still. "He never mentioned her to me." Leonard nodded. "He wouldn't have. He thought silence was protection. He was that kind of man." When I left the campus, the photograph felt heavier in my bag. I drove to the lake that weekend, Lake Elmore, the place Daniel had written about. The dock was still there, though weathered and gray. I knelt and ran my hand along the boards. Between two loose planks, something caught the light, a small metal tin, rusted but intact. Inside was a folded note sealed in plastic. The ink had faded, but the words were legible. "To whoever finds this, forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving." I stood there for a long time, the water lapping softly at the shore. Whatever Daniel had done, he had tried to make peace with it in his own way. I didn't yet know what he wanted Marissa to forgive, but the clues were forming a pattern. The letters, the photograph, the lake, all threads of a story I wasn't meant to read, but couldn't ignore. That night, I wrote down every date, name, and phrase in my notebook. I wasn't investigating him out of anger. I was documenting the truth he couldn't finish telling. It was the librarian in me again, organizing sorrow into something that made sense. If you've ever chased a truth you weren't sure you wanted to find, share how it changed you in the comments, and subscribe to Her Voices, where understanding is its own form of forgiveness. The night after my trip to the lake, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's handwriting, "Forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving." I turned the words over in my mind until morning. The next day, I called the only person who could listen without judgment, Patricia Riley, my closest friend for nearly 20 years. Pat and I met when she started volunteering at the library after retiring from counseling. She was the kind of woman who could hear silence and understand what it meant. When I told her I'd found something in Daniel's things, she didn't rush to ask questions. She simply said, "Come over. I'll make tea." Her house smelled of cinnamon and old wood. We sat at her kitchen table, and I laid the photograph and the sealed envelope in front of her. She listened carefully as I explained the journal, the letters, the trip to the lake, the tin under the dock. When I finished, she reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "Ruth," she said softly, "you're not chasing a scandal. You're chasing understanding." I nodded, unsure. "But why would he write to Marissa and not me? Why her?" Pat leaned back, thinking. "Maybe because she carried a part of him you never could. The teacher in him might have needed to confess to his student, the daughter who inherited that part." I hadn't thought of it that way. I told her about the woman in the photograph, about Leonard's words, and about the line in the letter hinting at a mistake. Pat listened, then said, "Secrets don't always mean betrayal. Sometimes they mean unfinished grace. Maybe Daniel wrote those letters to heal something before it reached her." She poured more tea and continued, "You have a choice, Ruth. You can read everything at once and drown in it, or you can read one letter a day and let the truth arrive slowly. Understanding needs pacing." Her voice was calm, deliberate. "If you rush it, you'll only see guilt. If you go slow, you might see love trying to correct itself." Her words stayed with me. That evening, I took her advice. I created a small reading ritual, one letter each night after dinner, a notebook beside me for reflections. I lit a candle before opening the journal, as if preparing for prayer. The first night, Daniel wrote about Marissa's stubborn streak and how he admired of her independence. The next night, he wrote about regret missing her graduation because of a conference. His tone was apologetic, but proud. By the fifth letter, I began to sense a rhythm. These weren't random thoughts. They were progressions, a story unfolding slowly towards something he needed her to know. The final entries, though, grew heavier. The word forgiveness appeared more often. He mentioned doctor visits and uncertainty. I underlined the sentence, "There's something in our bloodline she deserves to understand." The next morning, I called Pat again. "I think this might be medical," I said. "He writes about tests and a burden she might carry." Pat's tone grew gentle. "Then you know what to do. Verify it before you imagine it. Truth first, worry later." That evening, I searched through Daniel's old filing cabinet until I found a folder labeled Health. Inside were checkups, prescriptions, and one unfamiliar document, a referral form to a cardiology clinic dated 2018. My heart tightened. The same year as that mysterious letter. I sat back, the pieces beginning to align. Maybe the secret he kept wasn't betrayal, but fear of what he might pass on, fear of burdening me. Still, I needed to be sure. When I told Pat, she said, "Then we'll find out together. You don't have to face this truth alone. If you've ever discovered that love can hide fear instead of deceit, tell me what that moment taught you." And subscribe to her voices, where every heart has its reason. The following week unfolded like a quiet investigation disguised as routine. I woke early, went about my day as usual, and then, every evening, returned to Daniel's journal, as if it were a living voice waiting to finish its sentence. Each letter revealed another layer, sometimes warmth, sometimes regret. I began writing down not just his words, but my reactions beside them, as though we were still having conversations through paper and time. The more I read, the more patterns appeared. He mentioned specific dates, doctor appointments, sleepless nights, and lines about the clinic that knows. The phrase repeated 3 times. On the 10th letter, he wrote, "Your mother thinks my heart just tires from age. Let her think that. Let her rest. You and I share something I've ignored too long." I underlined it in red. There it was, the reason he wrote to her and not to me. He hadn't been protecting himself, he'd been protecting us. Still, there were gaps. He never named the condition, never wrote what shared meant. I spent hours reading the medical form from his folder, the one dated 2018. It listed a cardiology clinic in Charlotte. I called them, explaining I was Daniel Callahan's widow, and asked whether they still had his records. The nurse, polite but firm, said, "We can confirm he was seen here, Mrs. Callahan, but we can't release his results without written consent or legal authorization." I thanked her and hung up, my heart heavy. Written consent. Daniel had always been meticulous. Perhaps he'd left permission somewhere. I searched every drawer, every envelope, every corner of his desk, until I found a small folded note inside his will folder. It read, "If Ruth ever needs my records, she has my full consent." Signed, dated, witnessed by his colleague, Leonard Brooks. I drove to the clinic the next day, note in hand. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and lemon polish. The receptionist scanned the paper, nodded, and asked me to wait. When the doctor finally met me, she spoke kindly. "Your husband came here for genetic testing. He suspected a hereditary heart condition, something that could be passed to his children." I felt the world slow. "Did he ever receive results?" I asked. She looked at the file. "Yes, but he didn't return for follow-up. He likely knew the risk but chose not to act on it. Maybe he didn't want to worry you." On the drive home, I replayed the doctor's words. My hands trembled on the wheel, but not from fear, from a strange relief. The secret wasn't betrayal at all. It was protection wrapped in silence. Still, that silence had cost me peace. When I told Pat, she nodded quietly. "So, the truth was never about another woman," she said. "It was about your daughter's future." I thought about the letters again, 23 of them in total, each like a breadcrumb leading to this moment. 23 letters, 10 years, one secret condition. My notebook became a record of both guilt and grace, but one entry still haunted me, the last page of the journal. It was dated the 10th of June, 2021, 3 weeks before Daniel passed. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blotched as if written in pain. "If Ruth ever finds this, tell her I..." The line ended there. The rest was a smear. Maybe his hand slipped, maybe his heart gave out mid-sentence. I traced the unfinished line with my finger and whispered, "Tell me what, Daniel?" The days that followed were a blur of errands and restless thought. I wanted to call Marissa and tell her everything, but something in me resisted. I wanted to deliver, not panic, but peace. She had Daniel's same stubborn streak, his same need to solve problems herself. If I rushed her, she might run from the truth instead of facing it. Instead, I began planning how to share it the right way. I photocopied the medical letter and placed it in a folder marked "For Marissa." I also printed one of Daniel's journal entries, the gentlest one, where he wrote, Courage runs in our blood. I pray she inherits that more than anything. Each night, I read one final letter aloud in the living room, as if he were still there beside me. The sound of my voice steadied me. By the 12th night, I knew what I had to do. I would go to Atlanta, give Marissa the journal, and let her decide what to do with it. Not as her mother trying to control her, but as her father's messenger finishing his unfinished sentence. If you've ever carried someone's truth long enough to understand it before sharing it, tell me what helped you find that balance. And subscribe to her voices where quiet courage always speaks loudest. I arrived in Atlanta on a Saturday morning, the journal wrapped in a soft cloth inside my bag. The drive had been long but calm, the kind of road that gives you time to think. I rehearsed what I'd say 100 different ways, but every version ended with silence. Some truths can't be introduced, they can only be opened. Marissa lived in a modest townhouse near the park. When she opened the door, she looked surprised but happy. "Mom, why didn't you tell me you were coming?" I smiled. "Because you might have told me not to." She laughed and hugged me tightly. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and lavender, her father's favorite scents. We sat on the couch, sunlight spilling across the rug. "How are you really?" she asked. I hesitated, then placed the journal between us. "I found something, sweetheart. It's from your father." She stared at it, the color draining slightly from her face. "Is it about me?" "Yes," I said softly. "And it's time you read it." She turned the leather cover slowly, as though it might break. The first few pages made her smile. The childhood stories, the words of love. Then, as she read further, her expression changed. She reached the section about his fear and guilt, and her eyes filled. "He wrote all this?" she whispered. "For 10 years?" I nodded. When she reached the part mentioning the lake, she looked up. "You went there, didn't you?" I admitted I had. I told her about the tin under the dock and the note inside. Her hands trembled. "Why didn't he tell us?" she asked. I took a breath. "Because he thought silence was love. He was wrong, but he meant well." Finally, I handed her the sealed envelope. "This was tucked in the back. I didn't open it. I think you should." She broke the seal with care and unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved quickly, lips parting as she read. Then she handed it to me. "You should see this too." Daniel's handwriting was faint but clear. "My dear Marissa, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I want you to know the truth I couldn't bring myself to say aloud. Years ago, doctors told me I carried a genetic heart condition. I didn't want to frighten your mother or you until I knew for sure. I never followed up, and that is my greatest regret. You deserve the chance to be tested, to be safe. I wrote these letters because I wanted you to feel guided, not burdened. Tell your mother I loved her enough to spare her worry, but I should have trusted her strength instead. Tell her I'm sorry." By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. Marissa covered her mouth, tears streaming silently. "He was trying to protect us," she whispered. I nodded. "Yes, and he forgot that truth can protect better than silence." We sat quietly for a long while. Outside, children played in the park, laughter carrying through the open window. Finally, Marissa said, "I need to take those tests." Her voice was firm now, anchored. "I'll call my doctor Monday." I reached for her hand. "Good. That's what he wanted, for you to live wisely, not fearfully." She leaned her head on my shoulder like she hadn't done since she was a teenager. "Do you hate him for keeping it from you?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "No, I think he was afraid I'd break, when really I was waiting to be trusted." When I left later that evening, the journal stayed with her. "Keep it," I said. "It's his way of talking to you when words fall short." She hugged me again, whispering, "You were right to come." Driving home through the quiet highway, I felt something ease inside me. For months, Daniel's silence had felt like a wall between us. Now I realized it was a bridge awkwardly built, but leading to the same place. When I got home, I lit a candle beside his photo and whispered, "I finished it for you." The flame flickered gently, as if in answer. If you've ever had to carry someone's unfinished words and find peace in them, share that moment in the comments, and subscribe to Her Voices, where truth finds its way home. The morning after returning to Asheville, the house felt lighter, as though Daniel's absence had shifted into presence again. For the first time in months, I didn't wake with that familiar ache behind my ribs. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight touching the rim of his old mug. I thought about Marissa, about the letter, about how silence can wound even when it's meant to protect. Love, I decided, is not measured by what we hide, but by what we're brave enough to say. That week, Marissa kept her promise. She called the clinic, scheduled her tests, and updated me on every step. "They said the results will take 2 weeks," she told me over the phone. Her voice was steady now, stronger. I'm not afraid anymore, Mom. I smiled. That's your father's courage showing through, I said, and maybe a little of mine. A few days later, I visited the same cardiology clinic Daniel had gone to years before. I handed the doctor a copy of his letter, the part where he mentioned his genetic condition, and asked them to add it to his records. The doctor nodded, eyes kind. It's rare to see a family bring closure like this, she said. I told her it wasn't closure. Exactly, it was continuation. We're finishing the story he started, I said. On the drive home, I stopped by the university to see Leonard Brooks again. His office looked smaller now, crowded with books. When I told him what I'd learned, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. That sounds like Daniel, he said. Always trying to carry the weight for everyone else. He smiled faintly. I'm glad you know now. He wanted peace for you both. I thanked him for witnessing the note that gave me access to the truth. You gave me back my husband's honesty, I told him. He did that himself, Leonard said. You just had the heart to read it. Back home, I gathered Daniel's old teaching materials, essays, notebooks, and a box of his favorite books. I decided to donate them to the high school library where he'd taught for so long. Before I sealed the box, I slipped one of his letters, the very first one, between the pages of To Kill a Mockingbird. It felt right. Truth belongs among lessons, and that book had been his compass for years. The following week, Marissa called again. Mom, she said, her voice trembling. I got the results. I held my breath. Everything's normal. No sign of the condition. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Relief flooded through me. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep. That's the ending he wanted, I said softly. You're free from the fear he carried. She sniffled on the other end. I wish he could have told you himself. I smiled into the phone. He did, sweetheart, just in his own way. That night, I sat by the window and reread one of Daniel's lighter entries, the one where he wrote, If your mother ever reads this, tell her my favorite sound was her laughter when she forgot anyone was listening. I laughed then, softly, for him. The sound filled the room like forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, small changes bloomed around me. I started attending a local grief support group, not because I felt lost, but because I wanted to help others find footing. I told part of my story there, carefully, without names. One woman asked, How did you forgive him? I said, I didn't need to. Understanding replaced the need. Spring came early that year. The magnolia tree in the front yard burst into bloom, pink and full. I took it as a sign not from above, but from life itself, reminding me that renewal doesn't erase the past, it grows from it. Before going to bed, I placed the rusted tin I'd found under the lake dock on the mantel beside Daniel's photo. Inside was the note that started it all. Forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving, I whispered. You were right, Daniel. And you left more than you knew. If you've ever turned pain into understanding and found peace in the truth, share it in the comments, and subscribe to Her Voices, where healing speaks softly but lasts forever. 6 months later, the air in Asheville carried that soft warmth of early autumn, the kind Daniel used to call forgiving weather. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the mountains dim behind a haze of gold. Marissa was visiting for the weekend, her car parked under the maple tree that had just begun to turn red. She came out holding the journal, now worn at the edges, the pages marked with colored tabs. I still read one letter every Sunday, she said, sitting beside me. It helps me feel close to him, but also to you. I smiled. He'd like that. He always believed words outlast us. She nodded, tracing the embossed initials on the cover. I think he was writing to both of us, really. I just didn't see it before. We sat quietly, watching the light change. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and something familiar, the same smell that lingered in Daniel's study. Marissa took a deep breath and said, I had another test last week. The doctor said everything still looks perfect. She told me to keep up the checkups just in case. Her tone was calm, certain. I felt my chest loosen. That's good, I said. It means his silence did one good thing, it brought us here. After dinner, we went through a box of old photographs. One showed Daniel at the blackboard, mid-lecture, chalk dust on his sleeve. Another, him holding Marissa on his shoulders, her face lit with laughter. We placed them in a frame together. 2 lessons in one, Marissa said. The teacher and the student. When she left the next morning, she hugged me longer than usual. You know, she whispered, I think Dad wanted you to find that journal. He just needed time to make sure you'd be ready. I looked at her, eyes warm. Maybe that's what love is? A message waiting for the right moment. After she drove off, I stayed on the porch, the journal resting on my lap. The sun rose higher, catching the gold thread of the binding. I opened to one final page I hadn't noticed before, blank except for one sentence. Daniel had written faintly in pencil. Some letters are meant to be opened when the heart is ready, not before. I closed the journal and smiled, a quiet peace settling over me. Life didn't give me every answer, but it gave me enough to live kindly with the mystery. Thank you for listening. If you've ever found something that changed how you saw someone you loved, share it in the comments. Subscribe to Her Voices, and remember, your voice matters.